The mop bucket was still rolling when Sylvia Ashby said it. "He's just the janitor," she told the two men in dress uniforms beside her, waving one manicured hand at the man in the faded gray coverall crouched by the server rack. "He empties the bins on this floor, gentlemen. He's not who you want to be talking to about optics for tomorrow." Why would a four-star general salute the janitor? That is the question this story answers, and the answer is worth more than the billion-dollar contract everyone in that room was about to lose. Stay through to the boardroom. The salute is only the first thing this story explains. Silas Foley did not look up right away. He finished seating the connector he'd been holding, set his multimeter down without a sound, and rose the way a man rises who has spent 11 years learning that sudden movement in a room full of brass gets you noticed for the wrong reasons. He was 39 years old, and there was a stillness in his shoulders that had nothing to do with the coverall or the half-worn patch over his heart. General Quentin Merriweather, 58, silver-haired, 4 stars, retired into a consulting title that still made rooms go quiet, stopped walking. He stopped the way a man stops when he has seen something the floor did not prepare him for. Then he brought his hand up in a salute so crisp it looked rehearsed, though it wasn't. It was old, and it was real, and every visiting officer behind him froze mid-step to mirror it before their brains had caught up to their arms. Sylvia Ashby's mouth stayed open on a word she never finished. Nobody in the room could explain what they were looking at. A man in a maintenance uniform, a wrench-shaped grease stain drying near his collar, was being saluted by a general who did not salute anyone anymore, not even other generals. As a matter of principle, he'd been quoted on twice in defense trade journals. Tobias Northcott, 36, lead systems engineer, the man who had spent the last 6 years referring to Silas as the tech guy, without ever learning if that was even his title, took one step backward as if the floor had tilted under him. Merriweather held the salute for 3 full seconds. Then he lowered his hand, walked past the CEO of Ashby Dynamics without acknowledging she had spoken, and extended that same hand to the man in the coveralls. "Sergeant First Class Foley," he said, and it was not a question. The overhead lights hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a printer kept spitting paper into a tray nobody was collecting. Sylvia Ashby stood with her reflection caught faintly in the glass partition behind her, checking it without meaning to, the way she always did before she remembered anyone was watching, and for the first time in longer than she could recall, nobody was watching her at all. 6 days earlier, at 6:40 in the morning, Silas Foley knelt on the same worn patch of hallway carpet at home that he knelt on every school day, and adjusted the left strap of his daughter's backpack exactly 1 notch tighter than she'd set it herself. Alice Foley, 8 years old, 3rd grade, stood with the patience of someone twice her age and watched him do it without complaint, because this was the ritual, and rituals in that house were never explained, only performed. 2 taps on her shoulder when he was done. Never 3. She didn't know why. He didn't either, not really. Only that it had started the year Corinne died, when Alice was 3 and needed something that repeated exactly the same way every single day, and it had simply never stopped being necessary for either of them. They walked the 4 blocks to Jefferson Elementary the way they always did, Silas matching his stride to her shorter one without seeming to think about it, the same unconscious calibration he'd once used walking point through terrain that did not forgive a wrong step. Alice narrated the sidewalk cracks like a survey team. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without needing to respond to prove he had. "Did you fix the thing at work yet?" she asked, not looking up from a crack shaped, in her opinion, like Ohio. "Which thing?" "The one you don't talk about at dinner." He almost smiled. "Working on it." What she did not know, what almost no one at Ashby Dynamics knew, was that the man walking her to school had spent 11 years as an Army systems engineer, the kind who built things other engineers were later handed manuals for. He had designed the Army's first portable fault isolation module from a folding table in a supply depot, using parts requisitioned under 3 different names because the official channel moved too slowly to keep soldiers alive. He had signed his work with initials stamped into the casing, because his name never seemed to make it onto the paperwork that mattered. An early medical discharge policy had ended that career on paper faster than any injury had ended it, in fact, and Corinne's illness had ended something larger only 2 years after that. She died of ovarian cancer when Alice was 3, An Army logistics officer who had met her husband while he was still called an engineer instead of the tech guy, and who used to tell him, folding laundry in a house that never had enough space for the man's restlessness, that a name didn't need to be on the wall if it was already in the work. He had believed her then. He had built a life around believing her since. Ashby Dynamics had one thing Silas needed more than status: a maintenance shift that ended at 3:10 in time to walk Alice home. He had taken the job specifically for that reason and had never once corrected anyone who assumed it was the only kind of job he was capable of. At the school gate, Alice turned, the exact half-turn she always made, and said, "2 knocks," reminding him, though he never forgot. He gave them against the strap of her backpack and watched her disappear through the doors before he turned back toward a building where, in 6 days, nobody would remember his name until they had no choice. The diagnostic suite on the 4th floor of Ashby Dynamics had been screaming since 7 a.m. 3 engineers stood around the fault isolation console feeding it test after test, and the console kept returning the same result. An intermittent signal fault in the avionics relay module, cause unknown, severity escalating, timeline to the Pentagon site visit now down to 31 hours. Sylvia Ashby stood at the glass wall of the lab in a suit the color of the storm outside, checking her reflection once before she stepped through the door and demanding, in the voice she used for board calls, to know why this was still broken. "We've swapped the board twice," Tobias Northcott told her, sweat at his hairline despite the room's carefully maintained 68 degrees. "Diagnostics keep flagging phantom faults. It's not the hardware, near as we can tell. Might be corrupted firmware, might be the whole unit's end of life." "End of life," Sylvia repeated, "is not a phrase I can use with a room full of generals tomorrow." It was Silas who wheeled the supply cart through at that exact moment, because his rounds put him there at that exact moment every day, and it was Silas who paused, for less than 2 seconds, at the open door of the lab, listening to a low electrical hum under the console noise the way another man might glance at a headline in passing. "That's not the board," he said, quietly. Not loud enough to be a claim on anyone's attention, only loud enough to be heard. Every head in the room turned. "I'm sorry," Sylvia said, and there was nothing sorry in it. "The fault's not in the relay board," Silas said. "It's in the isolation module feeding it. There's a resonance in the housing. You can hear it if the room's quiet enough." Tobias Northcott laughed before he could stop himself, a short, disbelieving sound. "You can hear it," he repeated. "You empty the trash in this lab 3 nights a week. No offense, but this is a $500,000 diagnostic system, and we've got 4 engineers with graduate degrees standing here who can't isolate the fault. I don't think you're going to solve it by ear." "He's right, Silas," Sylvia said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "I appreciate you trying to help, but this needs actual expertise, and frankly, we don't have the bandwidth today to be polite about who does and doesn't belong in this conversation. Optics matter tomorrow. We need this handled by people qualified to handle it." Silas said nothing. He set the supply cart's brake, the small metallic click of it, the only sound in a room that had otherwise gone the particular kind of quiet that follows an insult nobody quite wants to acknowledge as one. He looked at the console for a moment longer than the moment required. Then he wheeled the cart back out into the hallway and went to finish his rounds, the way he had learned, a long time ago, to absorb dismissal without spending a single word defending himself against it. He did not go far. Ashby Dynamics kept its supply closet on the same floor as the diagnostic lab, close enough that when he propped the door and let his cart idle in the hallway, he could still hear the console's intermittent fault tone through the glass. A stutter every 40 seconds, then silence, then the stutter again, patient as a heartbeat with an irregular skip. Nobody asked him to stay. Nobody noticed that he had. He listened the way he had once listened to failing hydraulics in a supply depot with no manual on hand and men waiting on the far side of a fence for equipment that had to work the first time. He closed his eyes for half a second before anything else, a habit so old it no longer felt like a decision. The stutter. The silence, the stutter again, and underneath it, so faint that the engineer's handheld meters had been sweeping straight past it for 6 hours, a resonance that didn't belong to any board they'd swapped. Tobias Northcott caught him standing there an hour later, eyes closed, one hand flat against the isolation module's casing, like a man checking a patient's pulse. "What are you doing?" Tobias said. It wasn't really a question. "Listening." "To what exactly?" "There's a dead zone in the housing. Somebody potted this module with the wrong compound years back. Cheaper, doesn't dissipate heat the same way. It's been drifting out of tolerance every time the ambient temperature climbs past 71 degrees. That's why it only faults in the afternoon." Tobias folded his arms. Around them, two younger engineers had drifted closer, drawn by curiosity they weren't quite willing to admit to. "You're telling me you diagnosed a thermal tolerance drift with your hand?" "I'm telling you what I heard. We've got test benches worth more than your annual salary that couldn't find that." Silas opened his eyes. There was no anger in them, which unsettled Tobias more than anger would have. "Test benches measure what they're built to measure," Silas said. "They're not wrong. They're just not listening for this." One of the younger engineers, a woman named Priya who had been at Ashby Dynamics 8 months and had not yet learned who was and wasn't worth listening to, crouched beside the module and asked quietly, "How would you even fix that? If the potting compound's the problem, you'd have to open the housing, and nobody's touched the internals on this unit in years. There's no schematic on file past the outer casing." "There doesn't need to be," Silas said. "I know where the fault line runs." Tobias's arms stayed folded, but something in his face had shifted from contempt towards something colder and more uncomfortable, the beginning of doubt. "How," he said, "would a maintenance tech know where the fault line runs in a module with no available schematic?" Silas didn't answer that. He knelt instead, opened the panel Ashby Dynamics' own engineers hadn't touched in years, and reached for a tool that wasn't on his cart because he'd brought his own, quietly, from home, the morning after he'd first heard that stutter 3 weeks ago and recognized in the rhythm of it something he'd built with his own hands a lifetime before anyone in that room had learned to call him the tech guy. Nobody stopped him. Nobody, in that moment, entirely believed he'd get anywhere. That was, in its own way, the last hour anyone in that building would be allowed to believe that about him. The committee arrived 9 minutes early, which nobody had accounted for, and General Quentin Merriweather walked onto the 4th floor, flanked by 2 colonels and a Department of Defense compliance officer, just as Silas had the isolation module's housing open on a rolling cart, wires laid out in an order only he seemed to understand. Sylvia Ashby, mid-sentence in her rehearsed welcome, stopped speaking entirely. Tobias Northcott's hand actually rose, as if to physically block the sight line between the general and the maintenance technician kneeling on the floor, then dropped, because there was nothing to say that would make this look like anything other than exactly what it was. "We can reconvene once the system's fully operational," Sylvia offered, too brightly. "This is just routine maintenance." "Let him work," Merriweather said, and something in the way he said it made 3 engineers who did not report to him stand up straighter anyway. Silas didn't look up. He'd traced the resonance to a hairline fracture in the potting compound exactly where he expected it, a flaw invisible to any bench test built to look for electrical failure rather than a structural one, and he worked with the unhurried precision of a man who has done this exact motion under far worse lighting, with far less time. He resoldered a bridge connection, reseated a shielded lead, and pressed 2 fingers against the housing to feel for the resonance that had been haunting the lab all week. It was gone. He powered the module back into the diagnostic chain. The stutter tone that had plagued the system for 2 days did not return. The console's fault log, for the first time in 72 hours, ran clean. It was Priya who saw the stamp first, crouched beside him out of habit now rather than curiosity, and went very still. "There's a serial etched into the casing," she said, to no one and everyone. "Under the scorch mark. It's not a manufacturer code. It's initials." General Merriweather crossed the room before anyone else moved, crouched with a stiffness that suggested joints that remembered decades of worse floors, and turned the module gently toward the light. He read the stamp, SF, pressed into the metal the old way by hand, the way a soldier marks something he built and does not expect to get credit for, and he did not say anything for a long moment. "This module," Merriweather said, finally straightening, "isn't a commercial unit at all. I know because I signed the requisition that got the first version fielded. It saved lives in a way most people in this room will never be told about, because it was never supposed to have a name attached to it beyond a set of initials nobody bothered chasing down. He looked at Silas.
You didn't maintain this system, did you, Sergeant? No, sir, Silas said. 2 words, nothing more. You built it. The silence that followed was not the same silence as before. Sylvia Ashby stood with her reflection ghosting faintly in the glass behind her and did not check it once. Tobias Northcott looked at the man he had told, 6 hours earlier, that he didn't think he'd solve anything by ear, and found he had no version of that sentence left that he was willing to repeat out loud. This was, everyone in that room would later understand, only the middle of what the morning had to explain. The Pentagon compliance officer, a quiet woman named Diane who had said almost nothing until then, was the one who found the second problem, and she found it within the hour, paging through the module's design history on a tablet with the flat procedural calm of someone who had flagged worse. This unit's design credit is on file, she said, assigned to a subcontractor called Fenwick Systems Integration, 9 years ago. There's no engineer named Foley anywhere in this patent chain. She looked up. If the true inventor of a component this integral to a federal contract has been misattributed on the official record, that's not a clerical matter. That's a materiality issue for the integrity review. It could void the renewal entirely. Sylvia Ashby's face did something complicated, fear arriving a half-second before she could arrange her features around it. There has to be an explanation, she said, and for once it did not sound like a woman managing optics. It sounded like a woman genuinely afraid of what the explanation might be. She found Silas alone by the loading dock that evening, coverall traded for a jacket, waiting for the bus that got him home in time for dinner. She did not lead with an apology. I can bring you on as a consultant, she said instead. Off the books, contract basis, no title change on paper. You fix what needs fixing before the vote, we keep this quiet, and everyone's protected, you included. Silas looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at a failing module before he touched it, assessing, unhurried, already understanding more than he was saying. Protected from what? He asked. The truth or the paperwork? Sylvia didn't answer that. She didn't have to. The offer stood there between them, unclaimed, the way a man's real name had stood unclaimed on a patent filing for 9 years. Toby Harmon had worked the maintenance floor at Ashby Dynamics for 11 years, 6 of them alongside Silas, and in all that time, he had never once asked the quiet man beside him what he'd done before this. That changed on the 3rd night after the demonstration, when Toby, 52 years old and built like a man who'd spent 3 decades trusting his hands over any manual, went looking through a decommissioned filing cabinet in the basement archive for a part number nobody else remembered existed, and found instead a folder that should not have survived the last records purge. It was a discrepancy report, dated 9 years back, unsigned by anyone still employed at the company, flagging an invoice from Fenwick Systems Integration for design consultation services on a fault isolation module that, according to the same report, Fenwick had never actually performed engineering work on. The approval signature at the bottom belonged to Barrett Ashby, 71 now, founder, chairman emeritus, the man whose name was on the building's cornerstone. The date on the approval was 6 weeks before a separate filing, buried 2 folders deeper, showing Barrett Ashby had acquired a 12% equity stake in Fenwick Systems Integration under a holding company that shared his late wife's maiden name. Toby read it twice. Then he brought it to Silas without a word of preamble, set it on the workbench between them, and said the only sentence the moment needed. Your name was worth something to somebody, and they sold it. Silas read it in silence, the scorched module still sitting nearby like a witness that had been waiting 9 years to testify. He did not say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was not anger in his voice, only the flat certainty of a man confirming something he had long suspected and never had proof of. He needed a subcontractor with a design credit to justify the equity position, Silas said, and I was the easiest name to erase because nobody ever wrote it down to begin with.
Tobias Northcott received his instructions from Sylvia's office the next morning, delivered through an assistant rather than in person, which told him everything about how deniable this was meant to be. The discrepancy report, if it surfaced during the compliance review, was to be characterized as an unverified historical artifact of no evidentiary value, and he was to ensure Diane's office never saw the original. Tobias sat with that instruction for 11 minutes by the clock on his monitor. He thought about the stamp scorched into the module's casing. He thought about the sentence he'd said out loud 6 days earlier, "I don't think you're going to solve it by ear." And how completely, quietly wrong he had been about a man he'd shared a hallway with for 6 years without ever asking his name properly. At 9:14 the next morning, in the middle of General Merriweather's formal review session, Tobias Northcott walked to the front of the room, past Sylvia Ashby's rising alarm, and placed the discrepancy report directly into the general's hands. "You should see this before the vote," he said. "It's not an artifact. It's evidence." The boardroom at Ashby Dynamics had a long walnut table Barrett Ashby had ordered, built the year he founded the company, and it was at that table, 71 years old and still carrying himself like a man who expected deference by default, that he was asked to explain a signature that was unmistakably his. Sylvia sat across from him, the discrepancy report and the equity filing laid side by side in front of her, and for the first time in the 6 days since a general had saluted a janitor, she did not check her reflection in the glass behind her father even once. "You approved a payment for work that was never done," she said, "so you could justify buying into a company you already had a stake in, using another man's invention as the cover story." "I built this company from nothing," Barrett said. "I made decisions that kept the lights on. You don't understand what the industry looked like." "I understand the timeline," Sylvia said, and her voice did not rise, which made it worse. "The equity transfer went into the holding company under Mother's maiden name 6 weeks after this approval. That's not industry pressure. That's a man hiding a payout from his own board." She turned the folder toward him another inch, though he had clearly already memorized every line of it. "That stake funded the trust that funded my education. My apartment in the city before I ever set foot in this building. Half of what I call mine came from a theft I didn't know I was standing on." Barrett said nothing. General Merriweather, seated at the far end with Diane beside him, said nothing either, letting the silence do the procedural work no accusation could. It was Sylvia who finally moved, not toward her father, but toward the phone on the table, where she instructed her assistant, in a voice gone perfectly level, to draft the paperwork voiding the Fenwick equity stake in its entirety, effective immediately, and to begin the process of restoring the original design patent to the name it should always have carried. She found Silas afterward in the hallway outside, still in his gray coverall, waiting the way he waited for everything, without urgency, without performance. "I can have your name back on that patent by the end of the month," she told him. "Full design credit. And I'd like to offer you a director's title. Engineering oversight, whatever compensation makes it right. Ashby Dynamics owes you 9 years, Mr. Foley, and I intend to pay it." Silas was quiet for a moment. Somewhere behind his eyes, he was hearing a voice that had been gone 5 years. Corinne, folding laundry in a kitchen too small for the size of the work he used to do, telling him something he had needed, more than once, to be reminded of. "My wife used to say a man's name doesn't need to be on the wall," he said, "if it's already in the work." He looked at Sylvia, and there was no triumph in it, only a kind of tired clarity. "Put my name back on the patent. That part's just honesty. I'd want that for anyone, not just me. But I don't need a title, and I don't need a corner office." "Then what do you want?" Sylvia asked, and it did not sound like a woman managing optics anymore. It sounded like a question she genuinely didn't know the answer to. "There's a scholarship fund I'd like the company to start," Silas said, "for military spouses studying engineering. Full ride, no strings, named for my wife. Corinne never got to finish the degree she started before she died. Army moved her 4 times in 3 years, and there was never enough runway. I want somebody else to get the runway. She didn't." Sylvia Ashby looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face, the checking, the arranging, the reflexive management of how a scene like this ought to look, simply stopped happening. Done, she said. Effective this quarter. And your name goes on it too, if you'll allow that much. I'll allow that much, Silas said. 3 months later, the Corinne Foley Engineering Fellowship for Military Spouses awarded its first 4 scholarships, and Sylvia Ashby stood at the small announcement ceremony without checking her reflection once in the glass behind the podium, because for the first time in longer than she could recall, the optics had stopped being the point. Toby Harmon kept his position on the maintenance floor and a quiet new title, Senior Technical Archivist, invented specifically because nobody wanted to lose the man who read old filing cabinets like other people read newspapers. Tobias Northcott kept his job too, though something in the way he spoke to junior engineers had changed permanently. He had started asking people what they used to do before assuming he already knew. Barrett Ashby resigned his chairman emeritus title within the month, quietly, without a press release, and the building's cornerstone was not altered, because Sylvia decided the record should show exactly what had been built there, good and otherwise. Silas Foley still wore the coverall 3 days a week, because the job still let him leave at 3:10, and because it turned out a director's title was never what he'd been missing. On a Tuesday in late spring, he walked the same 4 blocks to Jefferson Elementary he'd walked 100 times before, waited at the gate among the other parents, and knelt when Alice came through the doors, adjusting the left strap of her backpack 1 notch tighter, exactly the way he always had. She let him. She always did. "Did you get your name back on the thing?" she asked, matter of fact, the way she asked about anything that mattered to her. "I did." "Good," Alice said. "And nothing more. Because 8-year-olds understand justice more simply than boardrooms ever will," and then she reached up and gave him 2 taps on the shoulder, mirroring the ritual back at him for once instead of receiving it, and neither of them mentioned it again. The certificate rode folded small in his jacket's inner pocket, in the exact place a photograph of Corinne used to travel, and it did not feel like a replacement so much as company. If you believe quiet work deserves an honest name, you already know exactly what this story was really about.